So the other day I bought some butter knives. The tag on them had the word knives in English and below that the word couteau in what I immediately recognized as French. Now, I've never studied French, but I have studied Spanish and I learned quite a bit of Portuguese through an obsession with Brazilian pop music. But more importantly than that, I'm a huge language nerd who has spent a lot of time researching and learning about the Romance languages, how they evolved from Latin, and the systematic differences between them. This word immediately piqued my nerdy interest, and I started deconstructing it to find out how or if it might be related to some Spanish or even English words I already know. Beginning with the word couteau, we know that the final X at the end is just a plural marker for words that end in EAU, as seen in les oiseaux or les châteaux, so we can just take that off to get the singular form, couteau. Next, there's the EAU itself, which actually comes from Old French L, from the Latin suffix ellu, a diminutive suffix, through a complicated process where final L became eu and eventually o. The other vowel in this word is u, from Old French o, which was originally a Latin long o or short u in closed or unstressed syllables. A closed syllable, by the way, is basically one with two or more consonants in a row after the vowel. It's possible that in the original Latin word, the T was doubled. That would explain why the U before it was in a closed syllable, and also why it wasn't lost to lenition, a process of weakening consonants between vowels that occurred in the transition from Latin to French. From all of this evidence, we can reconstruct a hypothetical vulgar Latin word, coltello, ancestor to modern French couteau. Now it's time to start comparing. In Spanish, the word for knife is cuchillo, which looks like it might be related to the French word. We know from words like castillo, from Latin castello, that illo is the typical outcome of Latin ello in Spanish, so it has the same origin as French eau. In the Spanish word, there's a ch in there. This sound comes from an older sequence of y plus t that was usually the outcome of Latin ct, as in noche, from Latin nocte, and ocho, from Latin octo. So from the Spanish word cuchillo, we can reconstruct a hypothetical vulgar Latin word, coctello, but there's a problem with this interpretation. The typical outcome of Latin ct in French was it, as seen in French nuit and huit, where Spanish has noche and ocho. If the original vulgar Latin word was really cotello, like what we inferred from French, then we would expect the Spanish word to be something like cotillo, but it's not. And if the original vulgar Latin word was coctello, like what we reconstructed from Spanish, we would expect the French word to be something like cuiteau, but it's not. Clearly, something is wrong here. Was the original word cotello or coctello? Let's take a look at another Romance language to try and settle this debate. The Italian word for knife is coltello. Right away, we can see the ello suffix, which has remained more or less the same compared to what we see in French and Spanish. The cool thing about this word is that it actually clears up the cotello-coctello debate. I mentioned that Spanish ch often came from Latin sequences of ct, but that's not the only origin. Take the Spanish word mucho. It comes from Latin multos, just like the Italian word multo. However, in the transition to Spanish, the final L turned into a y sound between the vowel u and a consonant, and the resulting muito became modern mucho. We also know that final L's in French pretty consistently became w, which would explain why it's not present in French. It got absorbed by the preceding u. With all of this evidence in mind, we can now reconstruct a hypothetical vulgar Latin word, coltello, that became modern Italian coltello, Spanish cuchillo, and French couteau. I actually wanted to compare this to the Portuguese word for knife, but the Portuguese word is faca, which is obviously not related to anything going on in French, Spanish, or Italian. Now it's time for the test. Lucky for us, Latin is a well-documented language, so all it really takes is a simple Wiktionary search to see where the French word couteau actually comes from. And as it turns out, the Latin word was indeed coltello, a diminutive of culter, meaning knife or dagger. It's also related to the English words cutlass and cutlery, which are apparently not related to the English word cut. There is also a Portuguese word, cutelo, which doesn't mean knife, but is instead the word for cleaver, those big square knives that butchers use. We can even use this information to create a new Britannian word for knife by passing this Latin word through a series of sound changes, first chopping off that word final vowel, then shifting the stress to the first syllable, and finally finessing the vowels a bit, and voila, or vila, we have the Britannian word for knife, coltel. But that sounds awkward, so how about we do something interesting? It's pretty common for languages across the world to mix up their L's and R's. This is how Italian colonnello got borrowed into English as colonel, rather than the expected colno, or how Latin purpura was borrowed as purple rather than purpur. If we do this to the Britannian word for knife, we get corto. Je coupe los vegetables et un corto. And as it turns out, this exact sound change did happen in quite a few regional Romance languages, like Neapolitan, Lombard, Istriot, Venetian, and Aromanian. And just like that, we've not only created a new word for knife in Britannian, but we've also gained a deeper understanding and appreciation of the diversity of the Romance languages, what makes them different, and how they're still connected after all these years.
Let me see what you have. No!
Oh my God, why does he have